Hi, my name's Justin Chalfant. I'm a software engineer for Patch My PC. In this video, we're going to be showing you how you can install Microsoft System Center Configuration Manager in a lab environment. A little background on myself, since this is our first video and what we hope will be a series of videos on SCCM. Prior to my current role, I was a Premier Field Engineer for Microsoft supporting SCCM for 4 years. I always found that video was probably one of the most effective ways that I was able to learn, and I was able to contribute to some of the internal readiness programs we had for PFEs around SCCM. In this video, I just wanted to walk through the process to install SCCM, as well as some of the things that I often found customers might have misconfigured or things that are easily overlooked. We're going to make the assumption that you do have a lab set up, that you have a domain controller, you have DNS working, and you have a member server joined to that domain, and it's fully patched. In our case, we're going to be running Windows Server 2016, and we're going to be installing SCCM current branch 1802, which is currently the latest build out. The first thing that I want to look at is some of the recommended hardware configurations. So this was by far I would say the easiest one to overlook is the disk configuration if you're running a primary site as well as SQL co-located on your primary site server. So I'll include the documentation to this article, but this is the recommended hardware configuration. So what we're going to look at is creating some additional hard disk within our virtual machine that we're going to use for different application usages within SCCM. So for example, we're going to have our operating system drive. We're going to create an additional disk for config manager where it actually installs the source files. We're going to create an additional disk for our database MDF file, a different disk for our LDF file or our log file for our database, additional disk for our temp database, and then an additional disk for our content library. Me personally, I'm also going to add one for our source files, as well as an additional disk for our WSUS database. So what that's going to look like, I'm running Hyper-V. So what we're going to do is just come in here and add an additional hard drive. This first one is going to be for my configuration manager installation. Now, one thing I will note is that our host machine is actually it's spec'd out quite well. We have quite a few different SSD drives that we can use to put these disks on, so we can put them on different drives to improve performance. Now, if you only have one disk, or if you have 2 or 3, I would probably recommend putting the database log file, and the temp database file. If you have room to split those, I'd probably start with those first. So what I'm going to do is go ahead and name the virtual disk file, and I'm going to go ahead and put it on my D drive within my folder for this virtual machine. I'm going to go ahead and do next here. In our case, I'm going to do 50 gig, but within the hardware guide, it will tell you what each of these could be based on the number of clients you intend to support. So now that that's added, we'll come back to our SCCM server. This should happen on the fly, so we should be able to come into our disk management and see this additional disk and configure it. So I'll go ahead and initialize this, bring it online, and then go ahead and get it formatted. And I'll give it a volume name of SCCM_install. So if we come and look back here, we can see the additional drive here. In my lab, I'll show you what I'm intending on doing. So we're going to have our MDF for our database file, our LDF drive for our log file, our temp database file, our WSUS database, our source files. This could be optional if you intend to host your source files for packages and updates, for example, on a different server. And then our content library, where all the content gets placed on your site server. So I'll go ahead and pause the video while I complete this. All right, so I've gone ahead and created all of my different drives. So we've got our SCCM install drive, our MDF database, our LDF database file, our tempdb, WSUS database files, the source files, and the content library. Back on my host, we can see that I just added all these additional drives in there. I would recommend to still create these even if you're saving them to the same drive. Just because if you ever do expand your physical host in your lab, it's much easier to shut down the VM and simply move a few disks around than try to, for instance, move a SQL database, doing like a backup and recovery, and have to worry about that type of configuration for that. Now, one thing that I do want to add is our no SMS on drive file. So you can just take a look at that name, and we're going to copy that to the root of every drive that we do not want SCCM content library files to get copied to. In our case, that's going to be every drive except for our content library drive, which is going to be this J drive. All right, so I went ahead and copied that to all the drives except J. One thing that I will note is I did make a database folder on the root of all of the drives that I'm using for different database operations here. So that should be good as far as pre-creating the disk that I need. Once again, if you want to reference how large those disks can be within the hardware guide, it will base it on the number of clients, how big you would want to make your disk for the different things that we would be adding here. Now, the next thing that I'm going to do is install some of the prerequisites. So we're going to go ahead and run a PowerShell script to install IIS, as well as remote differential compression and bits. So these are different features within Windows Server that we need for SCCM to work for our site server and management point. So I'm just going to open a PowerShell window, paste in the command, and I'll include this in the description within the video. But this is just going to install IIS, bits, and remote differential compression. So I'll go ahead and pause while this installation completes. Okay, so that installation is now complete. I'll go ahead and close this window. The next thing that we're going to configure is our SQL Server, and we're going to be running this under a domain account. This is going to be a best practice. Generally, you're going to want to run your service under a domain account instead of running under the local system. In order to do that, we're going to need to create a service principal name within Active Directory for the service account that we're going to run the service under. So I'm just going to open a command line, and I'm going to paste in my command to create that service principal name. So this is just running a set SPN command, -A, and then the SQL service name, the server we're running, the port, and then the service account that we're using. So it looks like that is good. In my case, I already had this created, but you should see that it created it successfully. I'm also going to create one for the fully qualified domain name of my computer as well. And we can see that that looks good as well. All right, so I'll close that out. On the Active Directory side of things, that was just a user account that I was using as a service account where the password doesn't expire. The next thing that we're going to configure is our firewall to ensure that the ports for SQL are open. So we're going to add port 1433 for our SQL service, and then 4022 for our SQL broker, to ensure that we have those enabled within our domain profile. And that looks good. So I've already pre-downloaded SQL Server 2017. That is going to be a supported version for Config Manager Current Branch 1802. I will include a link out to the supported versions of SQL for Current Branch in case you're watching this down the road and you want to know whether there's a future version that's supported. I'm going to go ahead and go to Installation, and we're going to choose a new SQL Server standalone installation. All right, I went ahead and jumped past our product key, so I'm just going to go through the install, default for the updates. For the firewall, we've already enabled those ports, so we should be all set there. Now for SQL Server 2017, they did split up the reporting services to a separate download for the installation. So in our case, we're not going to install the reporting services or the management studio. This would be available if you're using 2016 or a previous version. But we are going to do the database engine. So that is going to be a requirement. If you're running 2016 or previous versions, you would probably want to go ahead and enable the management tools as well as reporting services, so you could enable those features in SCCM down the road. So that should be all we need. We'll go ahead and leave the default installation path for just the service. I'm going to leave the default instance name. Now this is where we're going to set our service account. So if I browse out, I'm going to enable my SCCM_SQL, that's my service account. Go ahead and enter our password. Then I'm going to copy that and paste that in for the database engine. So we're going to run the SQL agent as well as the SQL service under this service account. I am going to set my agent for the startup type to be automatic because I'm going to enable some maintenance tasks in the future for doing different things within SQL. All right, so I'm going to add the current user as an administrator for SQL. And then I also have a SCCM SQL admins group for full administrators. I'm going to go ahead and add that in here as well. Under the data directories, we're going to leave the default for the root directory for the system and user databases. But what we are going to change is the main temp database location. So instead of saving that under the C drive, we're going to add that to our temp DB drive that we created. And then I created that subfolder for database. We're going to add both of those temp database files here. So I'm just going to remove the default path, browse out to our temp DB, and then our database folder. For the temp database file, I'm going to change the auto growth to 256. And I'm going to set the auto growth for the log file as well to 256. So if we do grow, we're going to grow a bit larger so we don't grow as often for the database files for the temp DB. I'll leave the default initial size as that should be okay. Then we'll go ahead and do next here. And then install. All right, so our SQL database engine is complete as well as all of the components that needed. So I'll go ahead and close out of this. If we go look at our database folder for our temp DB, we can see all the files that were created there. The next thing that I'm going to install is our reporting services. So I'll go ahead and run this guy and then choose install. In my case, I'm just going to do the evaluation for 180 days and then install. I'll leave the default for the installation folder and let that complete. All right, that looks good. We won't worry about configuring it. That will be a future video when we go through some of the basic configurations after the initial installation. And I am going to install the Management Studio. So this is going to allow us to connect into SQL using SQL management tools. So I'm just going to choose install here and let this complete. Now this is also a separate installation for SQL Server 2017 that you can just download by just searching for the latest version of SQL Server 2017 Management Studio. Okay, so that installation is now complete. So if we come back and open our SQL Management Studio, I'm going to go ahead and choose to connect to my SQL Server. Under the properties of the server, we do want to configure the min and the max memory limits. So SCCM recommends to set at least 8 gig within the min, and then for the max, it's going to depend on your configuration. So for us, we're going to be running a standalone primary with SQL database on the same server as the site server. So in that case, they recommend the max 80% of the total available memory of the server. So within Hyper-V, we actually have 32 gigs assigned to this. So if I were to do 80% of that, we'll just do 1 gig times 32 equals, and then take 0.8 of that. And that's going to be 25.6 gig. So let me just go ahead and calculate that out. I'll just round off to 25 here. So then for the max, we'll come back in and set that guy here. So that's just going to make it so SQL doesn't use too much memory. We're just going to want to set that cap to 80%. Now I'm going to go ahead and reboot this guy just so we can get that all set before we install the latest cumulative update for SQL. All right, so we are all rebooted. So I'm looking at the documentation for the supported SQL versions for Configuration Manager current branch. So you probably would want to check this out. One thing that I do want to note here is for SQL Server 2017, it looks like it requires a minimum of cumulative update 2. So you will want to check this. Generally speaking, I would always recommend installing the latest cumulative update for the version of SQL that you have installed. So I've already downloaded that. It's currently cumulative update 6 for SQL Server 2017. So we'll just walk through this installation. All right, so we'll accept the EULA, choose the instance to patch. I'm not too worried about this. What I'll do is just a restart after we complete this. Now, if you wanted to, you could go find that process ID and kill it if you didn't want to worry about restarting after you perform this cumulative update. All right, it looks like everything went good installing the latest cumulative update. Just to be safe, I am going to go ahead and perform a quick restart on this server. All right, so we are back up. The next thing I'm going to install is WSUS. So if you plan to use software updates within SCCM, you are going to have to install the WSUS role. This is going to be optional, of course, if you don't want to use software updates. At least initially, you won't have to install this if you don't want to use that feature. But in our case, we will go ahead and get that all set up for us. So I'm just going to walk through the wizard here. Instead of using the Windows internal database, we're going to use our SQL Server since we already have that installed and configured, and we're going to be using that for SCCM as well. For my WSUS content folder, I'm going to store that within my content library. I'm going to store it on that same drive that my content library is going to go on for SCCM. So I'm just going to create a new folder called WSUS, and that's going to be the path that we use for the WSUS content folder. This will be used to download things like EULAs and metadata that you might need for license agreements within SCCM. So for the database, we're going to do sccm3.contoso.local, and we'll go ahead and check that. We successfully connected to SQL, and then we'll choose install. All right, so that installation is complete, but we do have to run the post-installation task that's going to actually install the database and configure everything that we need to start using it. All right, looks like WSUS is all good to go. One thing that I do want to configure, under the recommended hardware configuration, there are some WSUS configurations that we want to make within IIS to ensure that we have enough memory that we can use and we don't have any issues down the road for things like performance when clients are doing WSUS scans for compliance data. So I'll link out to this documentation, but what we're going to do is increase the queue length as well as the memory that IIS is going to use for our WSUS app service. So under the WSUS pool, if we go to the advanced settings, based on the documentation, we're going to increase the queue length to 2000. And then we're going to increase the memory limit by 4 times. So I'll just open a calculator, we'll paste that in, times it by 4. And then paste that in. That looks good. We'll do OK on this. And while we're doing this, we're going to go ahead and stop the service for the IIS app pool. And I'm going to go ahead and stop the WSUS service. And what I'm going to do, now this is going to be optional. If you didn't create a separate disk for WSUS, you wouldn't have to go through this process. But what I'm going to do is change the database path from the default install path that WSUS would configure to the disk that we created. So I'm going to open SQL Management Studio. And then OK. I'm going to go ahead and connect in, choose databases, and then our susDB. If we go and look at where that's currently stored, it's going to be that default path under the C drive. So I'll just copy that path and we'll just go ahead and browse there. And what we're going to do is detach the database. Now that we have the WSUS service and the IIS service stopped, I'm going to go ahead and choose the option to drop connections and then detach it. Then what I'm going to do is go back to our folder. I'm going to copy the SUS database, the MDF and the LDF. I'm going to go ahead and cut that, come over to my database disk and paste it into my folder. Now we're going to go back into the databases, attach a database, and go ahead and add this out. Browse that folder and choose our database file, and then OK. Looks like that looks good. If we come back here, we can see that our files are now on our WSUS path here. And if we look over at our actual folder, we can see that they got moved over there. Then what we're going to do is come back and start our WSUS service. Make sure that all looks good. And then we're going to start the IIS app pool for WSUS. Make sure that starts up OK and it looks good. All right, that looks good. So if we go back to my C drive and my prerequisites, the next thing we're going to install is the Windows 10 ADK. Now I'll include a link out. You're just going to want to make sure you get the latest Windows 10 ADK if you're installing the current branch of SCCM. I did use the offline version, so I just ran the installer and chose to download offline just so I could go through this process a little bit faster. I'm going to leave the default install path of the C drive. Choose the default here, accept the EULA. Now for this, we need to ensure that we have the deployment tools, Windows PE, USMT, and that's all we need as far as configuration manager goes. So this is going to ensure that we have all the features we need for imaging. This is also a requirement to get through the prereq check. In order for us to actually be able to install the site, we need to ensure that we install these 3 features within the Windows ADK. All right, so that installation is done. The next thing that we're going to do is extend the schema of Active Directory. So what you need to do this is you need to have the latest SCCM source files downloaded, run the installation to extract the files, and then I'm going to go ahead and just browse out. Within the SMS setup bin x64, there's going to be a file called ext ADSCH. So this is the tool that we need to extend the Active Directory schema. The schema is going to just add some additional attributes that SCCM uses to publish information such as boundaries and site information that our clients can look up in Active Directory to get that data. So what I'm going to do a run as, and just run this with an account that would have permissions to extend the schema. Okay, we'll run that. And it's just going to be a command line window. It is going to create a log file on the root of C. If we go ahead and open that up, what we're going to be looking for at the end is whether it successfully extended the schema. Looks like we're all set here. All right, so that looks good. The next thing that we're going to do is create the system management container with an Active Directory. We need to create this container if you want to publish any type of site information to Active Directory in order for your clients to look up information about what SCCM site, for example, they should assign to and what boundaries are available for getting content for the initial client installation. So on my domain controller, I've opened the AD Edit tool. Okay. And what we would do here is, let me actually reopen this up so I can show you how we connect. We would just right click, let me just remove this. We would click on connect to and then just leave the default naming, and that should connect you to your domain. So if we click in and go to my domain here, we should have a built-in container called system. What we would need to do is right click that and create a new object. The object type would be a new container, and then we would create a new container called system management. This is going to be the container where SCCM publishes its site information to. Now in my case, we can see we already have this created. But if this was a new environment and you haven't done this before, you would need to go create that. So if we come in and look at mine, what we can see is we've actually got 3 different sites that are already existing in this Active Directory environment. And that's totally fine. We'll walk through how we can do that in future videos, but it's totally fine to have multiple sites as long as we don't have overlapping boundaries for site assignment. But what we need to do is change the permissions of the system management container, and then we'd go to advanced, and we need to add the computer account of the new site server that you're going to install. So under object types, we're going to come in here and add computers. In my case, my server is called SCCM3. And what we need to do is give it permissions to this object and all descending objects. And we need to ensure that it has full control. So this is going to allow us to create all the attributes that we need for our site under the system management container. We'll choose OK and then apply. And it looks like we're all set here. All right, so going back to SCCM, I do generally like to pre-create my SCCM database so we can have control over how many files we create, as well as the initial size and the locations that we want to create that database to. So I'm going to go ahead and choose to create a new database. In my case, I'm going to name it CM_PR3. So that's just going to be the default prefix is CM_. And then the site code that I intend to use, so a 3-character site code that every site needs for SCCM, you can just name it whatever you want for that. In my case, this is going to be my 3rd site here. So I'm going to name it PR3. For the owner, you could either put your account here. I'll just put an SA. And then what we want to do is configure our files. So a good estimate is every client you have will be roughly maybe around 3 to 5, probably closer to 5 megabytes per client for the database size. This can also obviously vary based on how much hardware inventory classes you enable, your scanning options, and things like that. But what we're going to do for this lab is I'm going to create the initial size to be 1 gig, and we're going to create 4 different database files. Generally, I would recommend creating between 4 to 8, depending on how big your site is. So I'm going to go ahead and do 1, 2, 3 to add that. If we zoom in, I'm just going to name this for my actual database MDF files. I'm going to name this the first one, the second file, the third file, and the fourth file. Now I'm going to set the initial size to be 1 gig. You could scale this out based on how many clients you expect to have. Within the hardware guides, they also have some recommendations there for the database size based on the number of clients you intend to support that we can use to create this. So in my case, since I want the initial size to be about 1 gig, I'm going to go ahead and split these up into 256 megabytes for each of these files. For the log file, I'm going to go ahead and make the initial size of 512. And for the auto growth, I'm going to increase the auto growth for each of my MDF database files to 128. And for my log file, I'm going to make it 256. So this will just make it so as the database does grow, if you do reach if you do exceed the initial size that you create these database files for, it's going to grow less frequency if we improve or increase the file size for the auto growth. All right, this is also where I can change my path. So back on our drives, we had a different drive for our MDF files. So I'm going to go ahead and copy this path for our MDF database files and paste that in. And then for our log file, we also had a different drive for that. So if we come back over, we'll copy the path to our log file. And that's going to be where we save the log file path. Looking back at the hardware guide, it looks like the estimates here are roughly going to be 75 gig for the database size for every 25,000 clients. So you can either increase that or minimize that based on how much you expect to support. Also, just to talk about the CPU and the memory for the site server, the recommended to support the maximum number of supported clients, which would be 150,000 computers for a standalone primary site. We can see those numbers are quite high. But like I said, this is going to be based on the largest number of clients that config managers support. So if we look down here, we can see that this is based on supporting the maximum number. So obviously, if you're a smaller site and don't support 150,000 clients, you certainly probably would not need to start at 16 cores and 96 gig of memory. Back in the 2012 days for their documentation, Microsoft recommended the min to be 8 cores and 32 gigabytes of memory for a standalone primary site with SQL co-located. I would say that could probably still be a good starting point in current branch, and then you could scale up depending on how many clients you have and based on performance that you see. So that looks good. I'll go ahead and choose to create the database. We do want to make sure that the recovery model is set to simple though before we create this. That all looks good. And we'll choose OK. All right, so that process is complete. So if we jump back over to our database, we can see we have our log file created. It's looks good, 512 megs is what we created that. And then we should have 4 different MDF files, and that should equal a gig for that initial size. Now, obviously, this was scaled out to be just a lab environment with a couple of clients. That would probably be a good place to start if you're just setting this for your lab, to set that initial size to be a gig between the 4 files. Now, at this point, I think we've got most of the prerequisites done. So if we come back over here and launch our splash.hta within the extracted files. So if you use just the public download to get the trial, it's going to come in an exe format you can extract. If you're getting it from volume licensing, you might get it via an ISO. But if you mount that ISO, you should have the same type of file data that you see here. So we'll go ahead and launch the splash file to get the installation started. And we'll choose install and then yes. We'll walk through that. Now we're going to install a standalone primary site. Generally speaking, this would be almost what you would want in every environment. If you're going above 150,000 clients, that's where a CAS or a central administration site might come into play. But for the most part, that's generally not going to be needed unless you're a very large enterprise. For this, I'm going to just do the trial. If you had a product key, you could go ahead and enter that in. The trial will last 180 days, and you could, of course, put your product key in after the initial installation if you wanted to activate a trial install. I'm going to go ahead and choose the license agreements and accept all of those. Choose Next. Now, we do have some prerequisite files that we need to download. In my case, to save time, I already pre-downloaded them to a folder. So I'm just going to go ahead and go back and choose to use previously downloaded files and then choose Next. Okay, looks like that's good. We'll choose to just install English. You could add additional language here if you wanted. Same thing for the client side. We'll just enable English. Now here's where we add our site code. So there's going to be a 3-character site code that has to be unique per site. Give it a site name that's going to show up in your console and a description. And then for the installation path, I'm going to go ahead and change this to be on my D drive because that's the drive that I configured for my installation. And I'll just leave Microsoft Configuration Manager as the path. That's fine. I'm also going to choose to install the console and then Next here. Now we're going to install this as a standalone primary site. So we're not going to join an existing hierarchy if you did have a CAS set up. We're just going to do the standalone site that we could use. Choose Next here. And we'll go ahead and continue. In our case, we're going to be using our SQL server that is local to the server. So we're not using remote. So we're just going to keep that default as our local SCCM 3, which is the server we're running on. The instance name, we just left that default when we installed SQL, so we'll just leave it blank here. If you had a custom instance, you would go ahead and enter in that here. And then our database name, we can see since we gave the site code PR3, this is going to be the default context, CM_PR3. So that should use our existing database that we pre-configured. The broke report, we'll leave that default and choose Next. For our database path, it looks like it's just leaving the default value here. This should be ignored since we pre-created the database. It's going to use that existing one. But I'm going to go ahead and just enter in the path where we had our MDF file. So this is our server data file. And then I'm going to enter in the drive that we have our log file. But this would be if you didn't want to pre-create your database like I did. You could still have control over where Config Manager creates the database as far as the log file and the database files. So we'll choose Next here. We're going to install the SMS provider on this same machine. In my case, we are going to configure communications on each site system role. So we haven't set up certificates yet, but that could certainly be in a future video if that's something you guys would be interested in seeing. We're going to install the management point and the distribution point on this site server as well. So we could start setting up clients in our lab, and we would have the ability to manage them and deploy content to them with our distribution point. Now, you certainly could use a remote site system for this if you had additional servers that you wanted to set up. We'll choose Next here. We're going to go ahead and enable the cloud point. That's going to allow us to connect and see all the latest updates and get updates within our console. We're going to go ahead and install that on this main server as well. This is just a summary of what we've selected. We'll choose Next for the prerequisite check. One thing that I will note is while we're waiting for this to run, I'm going to go back into my installation path, back into my prerequisite files where I extracted my install. And then under the SMS setup and then the tools folder, we're going to have CM trace. This is our log viewer. I recommend copying this over to another location just so we don't ever have any conflicts when we're trying to do an update if you're using it from the install source. I'm going to just run it from the C drive. But this is going to be the default log viewer. So if we want to look at things like the prereq check, on the root of C, there's going to be a log file called config manager prereq. So we can see information about what's going on with the prereq check. So everything looks good. I did notice it does look like the check does fail to see that we have the min of 8 gigs, which are recommended for SQL. I would expect this is probably a bug with the way the checks are happening in SQL Server 2017, where it's relatively new, but we can verify that we do in fact have the min set to 8 gig. So that should be fine. That's just a warning anyways. So we should be able to go ahead and proceed with the installation. So I'll go ahead and choose that now. And then on the root of the C drive, we're going to see this config manager setup.log. This is where the core setup is going to happen. So if we were to open this log file, I'll just snap it over to the left and then have this up over on the right. This will just kind of show us what's going on in the background as we're performing the installation. So I'll go ahead and pause it while this completes. All right, so it looks like the core setup is now complete. One thing I will note is it is normal to see quite a bit of red in here. It's just CM trace that's highlighting different words of the log. So after the core install is done, there's still a few things happening on the background. But it did install the console at this point, so we should be able to open our SCCM console and go ahead and connect to our site. We're not going to go through any configurations in this video. If you want to monitor what's going on in the background, so the core install is done, but the installation of different components for SCCM is actually still happening. So if we go to our install folder, and then under the logs, this is going to be the logs for our site server. There's going to be a log file called sitecomp.log. That's going to be the site component manager. So we can see things going on in the background for different components that are actually getting installed. So for example, we just installed the notification service. It looks like now we're installing the SMS big green button, which is part of the management point. So we should see the management point kick off here soon if it hasn't already completed. But if you did want to kind of monitor just on the back end what's actually going on in the background until this UI gets completed, we can monitor that sitecomp.log. All right, so it looks like at this point we are pretty much all done. So I'll go ahead and close the installation. Come back to our console. It looks like everything is good. We're connected. We'll come over to our monitoring and then system status and then site status. Just make sure everything looks good. And that should be all there is to this video as far as the installation goes. Please feel free to leave a comment in the video and or accompanying blog post. We'd be happy to answer anything. In future videos, we should go more into the initial configuration as well as dig into each of the feature sets in a future video. Thank you.